Hi, my name's Jonathan Miller, and this is my virtual poster presentation for ELLs in the classroom for class 8Y43, section 4. So my problem statement. Simply, it's integrating ELL students, for me, will be one of the most difficult challenges in the classroom, assuming I don't know their first language. I worry about struggling to connect with that student as well as the student's ability to connect with their peers. I worry about disinterest in the work based on the language barrier, which is why I want to be proactive in equipping myself with the right knowledge and tools to learn about ELL integration before I experience it. So the statement of the research problem. As stated, the topic is ELL students in the classroom. We live in a country that is very highly acceptable to immigrants, and so we have a very high immigrant population of non-English speaking students. So more and more will be coming into our country and enrolling into our schools. So it's up to us as educators to make these adjustments in our classroom and accommodate as much as possible to see the most success that we can out of these students. Integration is extremely important. It's not up to just the student to integrate themselves, but it's up to us to help them integrate. And a lot of this has to do with not just simply, and you'll probably hear this repeated throughout this presentation, is that it's not just about academics within the classroom, but it also has to do with creating citizens of society. So the research question that I had asked was, how do I support ELL students in a grade 4 English language class to achieve the greatest possible success for reading, writing, speaking, and social connections? How do these look? Reading is the ability to decode, as well as to make meaning of what they're reading. Writing is to, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but to have proper grammar and spelling, the ability to edit and revise. Speaking is to speak and communicate appropriately, as well as clearly. And when we talk about social connections, it's finding those connections with our peers. Students can often come from diverse backgrounds, and to find those interactions or commonalities with our peers can be difficult when there is a language barrier. Can we create those social connections with our peers, as well as even the ability to communicate and make connections with the staff at the school? So we look at definition of central and relevant terms. We look at what an English language learner is. So an English language learner is generally a person who is learning English as an additional language to their mother tongue. It doesn't mean that it is their second language as it was once defined. We used to say English as a second language, but we look at it more as an English language learner because some people, this could be their third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh language, depending on where they're coming from and what their background is. So that's how we define that, is someone simply learning the English language. We look at some of the literature that was used here. We have the first one, which is team writing for team building. It's a collaborative writing approach for use in traditional and online classrooms of English language learners. What this article focused on was doing, instead of doing individual language learning, was to try and do it as a group. So when you group students together, you would have an assignment where they would do some peer editing for each other. This way, not only are they learning to write, but they're also looking at what their peers are doing of a similar background. That way they can look to see how they can correct someone else's work, check on their own revising and editing skills, as well as it also helps them not to feel as isolated, which has always been one of those cases where we're trying to integrate students. It makes them feel like they're a part of something. So this pushes the idea of speaking and listening for an ELL student. It talks about an online environment where studies are done through distance education, and these can also have significant importance. It also provides examples where ELL students do an activity which is called regrets. It's where these students will give you a list of regrets and they do, again, peer evaluations, as well as it helps to improve their own reading and their writing skills. But the second resource used was English Language Learner Teacher Effectiveness and the Common Core. Now, this is an article that was based on ELLs in California. As Canadians, we generally have an interest in what people do in other countries. And if you're not familiar with what the general population or demographics are in California, there's a high Latino population, specifically that come in from Mexico or migrate from Mexico or immigrate from Mexico. And what it talks about is how ELLs are often held to the same standard as traditional English-speaking students. But what they've started doing is they've tried to implement programs in California through pre-service teachers where they get extensive training prior to entering the workforce. As opposed to hoping that you might get the experience, they specifically place you so that you can get that extensive experience, because there's no doubt you will always have an ELL student in your classroom, specifically in California, but it will likely happen at some point in your career as well if you're in Canada. So the idea had to do with not lowering the standards of academics, but the approach and how we support and set the standard for ourselves as educators, the mindset that we come in with. So the article provides data, and it shows how students can succeed with proper support and will often surpass their English peers over the long haul with that proper support. The third resource is English Language Learners in a Digital Classroom. This one has to do with how iPads, when they're used in the classroom, how they enhance an ELL student's achievement. So what it's doing is it's talking about what the benefits are in terms of international keyboard, the portability of an iPad, the visuals it provides, and the language translation that is available to them where needed. It also states that it's not simply about using an iPad or using technology as a solution on its own, but in combination with teacher education and teacher support in order to make sure that we're bringing in the best opportunity for these students to succeed. So again, it's not individually as an iPad or technology, but using that teacher to support alongside that iPad. So again, just to recap, you look at that, the first article was a group approach. It talks about the isolation of students, which can often happen to VLL students. So it talks about bringing them together into groups so they don't feel as isolated, with a focus on listening and speaking, and revising and editing peer work. The ELLs in California, which is the extensive pre-service experience, which also has to do with making sure that they do that before they enter the classroom, and the technology for the ELLs, which again was the international keyboard, the portability, translations, and making sure that it's support from the teacher with the iPad, and that will provide the best success for those students. So the research action plan. The data sources that I had pulled up, or I was looking to use, we had looked at the interview. So an interview can basically be done either individually or it can be done as a group. When you're doing individual interviews, it's important to ask the same questions in the exact same order without any probing questions, because we're not trying to push anybody towards anything specific. We're trying to get them to give us make sure that we are consistent with what we are doing so that the data becomes reliable. And we'll talk a bit more about that in an upcoming slide here. So what the group interviewing is good for is that the people who are being interviewed, so the interviewees, they can interact and can become more comfortable and almost more organic, if you will, in terms of providing information, so they don't feel that it's structured and they have to be giving a specific answer. It becomes these almost sort of candid, honest conversations that happen. And also it's a type of it's a source that is qualitative, which for me is always more important than quantity. If we can get, more quantity out of qualitative sources, brilliant. But the quality is always more important than the quantity. You get more reliability that way. Second one that I was looking at was a journal. So basically what it is being an ongoing log of recorded activity. And it's one of those things where you can record daily interactions or weekly interactions, and then you have the opportunity to reflect upon these in order to improve the approaches going forward by ourselves as educators. And for me, it's one of those things where it's supported it supports the interview process. So when you combine it with an interview, it gives that extra piece that will allow you to be more productive, and provide better insight into what your interviews are giving. Also, it gives an opportunity for some people who maybe are quite uncomfortable or are uncomfortable speaking. They could be writing into a journal, right? And they can express themselves simply by writing down this information. And that way, we can have a look at their writing, and what their thoughts are. So it kind of gives you that sort of accommodation piece as well. Anecdotal notes, very basic. It has to do with observations. We do this all the time when we talk about, recording performance or recording behavioral things in terms of assessment, so we can reflect and determine where students require more support. Triangulation, validity, and reliability. I spoke to this a bit. So using each of the data resources or sources that we talked about before, which were the interviews, journals, and anecdotal notes, these they can increase or decrease the reliability based on, depends on the repetition of the answers. We're looking for consistent, unbiased questioning. So that's an important piece of that. And this can be done by questioning various students, teachers, cert teachers as well. And you compare those data sources to ensure the validity of these stakeholders. You're looking at making sure that everything is consistent as we're going along. And also what that does is it provides valuable perspective from all different sources. So we're looking at it from various different angles. So it'll be the student's perspective, it could be the principal's perspective, and your cert, who will have also another perspective on that. And coming together and putting all those perspectives together will allow you to really start pushing forward with a real plan of how you're going to be doing this. One thing that people often forget is to bring in the student as much as possible into the conversation. Just talk about the participants and the settings. Just look at the stakeholders. You have the students, the colleagues, the principal, and the parents, and the perspective from the professionals and the students, which I just spoken about. It's important that you get both perspectives to make sure everything is taken into consideration, and specifically, most importantly, the students. That's how we are going to improve what we're doing. It's not about what we think. What do they know? How do they feel? So on and so forth. So different places you could do it. Obviously, it's going to take place in the school, or I shouldn't say obviously, but it should. You have your library, your cert office, your staff room, different places that you can do it. And that can include whether you're doing it in group interviews or individual interviews. It depends on the size of the space that you need. We talked about ethical considerations. Important to gain permission from parents and students, and those slips must, or I believe should be, transparent in what you are going to cover. Your meeting location should be private or semi-private. One-on-one is always something to make sure you're not doing. Obviously, you don't want to put yourself in a vulnerable position. Consideration of the information being shared publicly. We're talking about name changing or gender change when referring to a student or students. If you're filming, always have the students back to the camera. If you're audio recording, you should be doing it, or at least consider doing it with a voice modulator. Always as well take into consideration what is the purpose of this research, because there are things that we need to understand when it comes to deeper cultural questions, whether that be people coming from another country or an ELL student, which could simply be somebody from a community within Canada that doesn't have as much access to the English language as one might expect. Look at the timeline. Again, interviews. We've got our monthly, once a week. Teacher journals, we're looking at the end of each month, and anecdotals, you're looking at daily or weekly. In closure, this is an excellent way to set ourselves up to make sure that we are not just creating good students, but excellent citizens in society.